Yo, what is up everyone? Back here with another video. So for today's video, I actually wanted to talk about something that I thought was particularly interesting in Regulation G. I think one thing that's kind of a curious topic to kind of go over is like how good are the Paradox Pokemon right now, right? Because typically like Paradox Pokemon are Pokemon that they have like uses, but as time has progressed they've kind of been falling down in usage a little bit. So for example, with Regulation G's inception, obviously we saw a huge steep decline in Fluttermane. Doesn't mean Flutter doesn't exist, but it is like obviously less popular, right? So as we see the increase of, or the increase of the power level, right? Like which Paradox Pokemon are still good and which aren't good, right? And also, what does restricted mean for the ones that aren't good because some of them became better, right? So, a couple I wanted to talk about, especially from Indianapolis weekend, I thought was particularly interesting. The first one I really wanted to touch on was Iron Jugulus. Iron Jugulus is actually a Pokemon that, in reality, did not have much play in previous formats. I believe in Regulation B, it had a little bit of play, so it wasn't like the most unpopular thing ever. But like besides that, it literally like was not a common Pokemon. Like it was not that good. But now we see it get top 8 in Indianapolis, and then it also had another top placement. It had, I believe, or 17th place and then 19th place with Andrew Ding, Shiliang Tang, and Justin Tang, right? So all of the teams, they had the same builds on them, of course. Now, what was really interesting about Iron Jugulus on this team that I think made it particularly strong was the fact that you had access to the Hurricane, right? So Iron Jugulus is typically a Pokemon you're not going to be seeing hitting particularly hard, but the reason why I think it was so good on this particular team is because you have Kyogre giving you access to a really strong flying move, which makes a worlds of difference for like Iron Jugulus actually being able to put on pressure against common Pokemon in the metagame. Hurricane is a much stronger tool than something like Air Slash for Jugulus. And then how good Snarl is in the metagame right now. The fact that you can use Snarl to weaken Calyrex Shadow on teams that don't particularly have like amazing Cali Shadow matchups or like maybe are a little bit weaker, it's pretty cool because you can obviously get a benefit out of that, right? So I definitely think Jugulus is a Pokemon that it won't be used that much, but it definitely is a lot better in this format, particularly because of how hard it beats Cali Shadow. Cali Shadow literally cannot run coverage to beat this thing besides Draining Kiss, and even then Draining Kiss is like a questionable answer because it's snarling you first, and then if you nasty plot, they snarl you again, right? They can attack you a bunch of times, so it's pretty I'd say it's pretty like so for it, right? It's not the most amazing thing ever. But yeah, I definitely think that like Iron Jugulus in general is really cool because it could put a lot of pressure on the grass types in the format could put pressure against Cali Shadow, not even to mention like it can snarl in front of other special attackers. So a pretty cool mon overall, and I think the Tailwind speed control is really nice, especially in a format like this. So that was one of the first I actually had thought of when I wanted to make this video. Next one I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the usual suspects real quick just because I don't want to pretend that these Pokemon are still not good. But I did mention Fluttermane got a little bit worse. So Fluttermane obviously is still going to have placements 100% regardless of what format we're in just because it's a really well-made Pokemon. It has a lot of good tools around it. The highest placing Paradox Pokemon was Fluttermane as well. It ended up getting second place, and it had Moonblast, Shadow Ball, Icy Wind, and Protect as its set. Pretty solid set overall. I mean, I think just having access to Booster Icy is really good in a restricted format, same way that Jugulus is good because of its speed control. So I definitely think there's a lot of good tools that Flutter can take advantage of that just give it like viability, right? Not to mention Sash when it's on Koraidon teams, because then you can run it to have support with Icy Wind and then Sash so it can survive any attack. And then on, some other teams will run specs as well. So it has a lot of good sets that it can use, kind of the same sets it's been using for a while. Sash is a little bit more popular now because of the Sunsetters in the format. But I think that's kind of cool. And it's definitely, Pokemon that you can expect to see around. As well, too, another Pokemon that's obviously incredibly good is Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt is just an incredibly strong Pokemon. It is a very, very solid tool. It has access to Assault Vest set with Electro Web and Snarl, which is incredibly good, like speed control, and also to just puts a lot of control over the game. It's a really bulky mon. When it's paired with Sunsetters, obviously, it's a great counter to Kyogre and other water types that Sunsetters might not enjoy dealing with, Pelipper in particular. And then you have, obviously the access to the Calm Mind set with Thunderclap and Dragon Pulse and Calm Mind. So there's a lot of it. There's a lot of stuff it can do. Basically, Raging Bolt is just kind of like a stat blob. In my opinion, it's kind of like almost a secondary restricted based on how good its stats are. So it's definitely a Pokemon you can expect to see around like a lot. And yeah, Raging Bolt, really solid Pokemon. Definitely very little flaws to it. Now, for the other Paradox Pokemon that I think I wanted to particularly mention, one that I thought had a lot of potential that hasn't been utilized as much yet is Screamtail. Screamtail is a Pokemon that has been like really good throughout a lot of different formats just because of its ability to do the Encore disable stuff. And in a format like this, where there's like the rise of Miraidon with choice specs, and there's like other strong restricteds that are using choice items, along with other Pokemon in general using choice items, I think this is a prime opportunity for Screamtail to work on like a really good setup team, or with a really good like Nasty Plot Mon or like Calm Mind Mon. So there's like a lot of cool things you can do with Screamtail. Not to mention too, it gets like a bevy of other support moves, which I could see giving it even more usage in like a restricted format. Having Thunder Wave access, for example, giving it like pseudo speed control, fake tears that you can use next to a special attacker. There's a lot of possibilities with this Pokemon that I think can like really work on it. And it's something like even Howl, right? You could like Howl next to Clear Eye like Groudon or Koraidon, for example, right? So there's a lot of cool things it can do. It's not like the greatest Pokemon of all time, but I'd say it's pretty on par with Jugulus in terms of how good it is. I'd actually argue Screamtail's probably a little bit better. It's really solid bulk across the board, really solid stats. So it's definitely something worth like considering, right? Um, excuse me, and something you can see like more frequently. All right, so other Paradox Pokemon I wanted to talk about. So you'll notice in Indianapolis, within the cut, there weren't like too many other slots you could see that were other than Raging Bolt and Fluttermane initially, and then the Jugulus, of course. So you might look at this and be like, okay, but there aren't many. But right here, you'll see there's a Gouging Fire. So Gouging Fire is a really solid Pokemon on certain compositions. It only really works on that Ting Lu Dozo type composition, and I could see how it would work next to Groudon because it activates, Gouging Fire's pretty much like photosynthesis, so it can spam like Snarls, and it can spam like, different support moves, and Howl next to Groudon. Pretty cool option. That being said, though, the mod is still obviously a little bit flawed in some cases. The biggest problem that Gouging Fire has is into other Raging Bolts. It can be particularly annoying to pilot it. But I did really like this take on it with Covert Cloak and Breaking Swipe, Snarl, Flare Blitz, and Howl. Realistically, like you're getting a lot of damage output right out of the Howl plus Flare Blitz. Flare Blitz is better into stuff like Calyrex because you can actually Flare Blitz it. Snarl's really good for shutting down stuff like opposing Calyrex Shadow. And then obviously you have the breaking swipe to reduce physical damage. So there's a lot of cool things that Gouging Fire can do. I don't know if it's a Pokemon that like will see a particular rise in usage. That being said though, like it is good enough where it's worth mentioning. I do think the fact that it can like Covert Cloak Snarl, ignore Icy Winds, like there's a lot of cool things it can accomplish there, right? So it's definitely a Pokemon you wouldn't ignore, but it's also not something that's like going to completely take over the format either. It's just one of those restricted to have a potential to support. So another restricted I want to talk about, especially with the rise of Miraidon, is Iron Bundle. I think Iron Bundle is actually a really good Pokemon in general. In Regulation B, saw the peak of its usage. Regulation C had it as well. It won a regional back then as well. Shilling Tang's team with King Gambit, Iron Bundle, a few others. But after that, it didn't really see much success. Like I think it just kind of fell off a little bit because of the way that the next formats kind of power crept, and like there wasn't as much room for bundle when like there's so much power level, and like even the slot for a water type is kind of contested when you want like Urshifu and other stuff. So overall, would I say that Bundle is a bad Pokemon? Absolutely not. I think what is really nice about Miraidon being added is it can run Sash or Covert Cloak, so you can kind of get around certain weaknesses that Bundle had of always having to run Booster Energy, and like Electric Terrain is a bit more accessible. Also, it helps in the mirror as well because you can go for Icy Winds, you can go for attacks, right? And if you run something cute like Terra Ground, then you can go for like Terra Ground, Icy Wind Discharge. There's like some cool things you can do next to Miraidon. That being said, though, I do think that like Bundle is a really solid support Pokemon. I think it's definitely something with really solid speed control that can put on a lot of pressure in this metagame, and I definitely think I could see like some merits of it next to the actual Miraidon teams. So that was just one of the Paradox Pokemon I felt like were worth highlighting here because that like fast speed control, encore pressure, like all these things in restricted formats are particularly like strong. Now, as we continue to scroll down, you might see like there's not too many others. There was an Iron Valiant, but to be honest with you guys, like I don't actually think Iron Valiant is that good. I think it's just kind of cope. I don't think the mon is like an insanely like strong mon or anything. Cool team of course, but like yeah, and nothing that like I would be particularly impressed by. As well too, we continue scrolling down here, right? We see that there are actually really a lack of like other Paradox Pokemon that kind of fit in, besides the ones that we have already touched on. I'm trying to see if there are any that I missed within the top 64 or whatever the thing is of indie. Any of you guys? No, I mean, Excuse me. Oh my god. But yeah, mostly like Raging Bolt, stuff like that, right? Now, it is worth noting that if you go down to the Paradox Pokemon, let me go find the Paradox Pokemon. There are a couple more that are like worth like discussing. So like obviously, for the Paradox Pokemon, like Brute Bonnet is something that's seen a little bit more play in this format, basically because it's like a dark type that can sit in front of Kali Shadow. I could see it potentially working on some teams, but the big problem that Brute Bonnet has is like it's kind of like an awkward speed tier, and it's like awkward as like a Pokemon in general, but it definitely has like some viability that it can take advantage of, right? Um, Great Tusk got power crept out. Iron Hands is worth mentioning just for the fact that it's still Iron Hands, so it can still accomplish some things. But like besides that, most of the other paradoxes have been power crept out, right? So the ones I kind of highlighted were the main ones I was thinking of. But like yeah, Brute Bonnet, Iron Hands, kind of the two that I think are still worth discussing. Iron Crown is kind of dead now. You're just better off using other steals and other Pokemon in the format where like there are just so many checks to it, especially with Rillaboom being on a lot of teams, right? Um, you know, I haven't really been the most impressed by Iron Boulder, and Iron Leaves is just bad. In terms of the other Paradox guys, like Walking Wake is actually worth mentioning as well. I don't want to forget that. That would be kind of silly. Walking Wake really good. Just it's pretty good on Sun teams though. Like that's the main area where it's gonna lie and like where it's gonna be. I wouldn't really see Walking Wake depart much from the Sun teams, right? So I feel like the last couple of restricteds, right? Like Iron Hands is there solely because it's a really bulky fighting electric type that could have some purpose on certain teams. But the biggest issue it has to fight right now is just that there are a lot of Pokemon, not only Incin with Will-O-Wisp everywhere that can parting shot it. If you run Clear Amulet Terra Fire, then if you're against like other certain Pokemon that can exploit that, being weak to ground moves can be a bit negative. Like it just feels like Iron Hands is fighting an uphill battle versus a lot of things, and like it kind of needs that Assault Vest for the bulk. But then if it's running the Assault Vest, it's really susceptible to Incin, right? Not to mention Mungus is like on almost every team. And then you have Walking Wake here. Obviously, Walking Wake really solid. Typically, always going to be chained to like the Life Orb, maybe the spec set, right? They always want to go like Hydro Steam, and then they want to have Draco Meteor, Flamethrower, and whatever other coverage move they choose. Typically, it's Protect if it's Life Orb. If it's specs, it's usually something different that they can use. So maybe Pulse for consistent attack. And then finally Bonnet. Like Bonnet is definitely a Pokemon that has a good enough speed tier where like if you were to give it a jolly nature, right? Like it can actually outspeed some common threats like at 112, like Calyrex Shadow and Tailwind. The problem is you have to invest the nature into it, and then as well too you lose out on some of the bulk, which is what makes Brute Bonnet really nice. That being said though, it is a really capable attacker. Like it actually has a really good attack stat. It has pretty good bulk. So I mean, even if you compare it to Amoonguss, and we think Amoonguss is really strong in this metagame, right? Like the stats on Brute Bonnet are objectively like better than Amoonguss, but the main drawback, of course, is that Brute Bonnet has a worse typing, right? So that's the thing. Well, it's a worse typing in some cases, right? In other cases, it could be better. But yeah, that's like kind of the main thing that you keep an eye out for when you're using something like Brute Bonnet. Also, too, like it typically wants to run physical, which makes it more susceptible to Incin, which then in that case, are you running a Clear Amulet on it, which then takes away from its sustainability. So like there's definitely a lot of ifs when you're using something like Brute Bonnet. And usually when you're using Bonnet, it's with Sun guys, which then you want Clear Amulet on the Sun guys, right? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. In my opinion, the Paradox Pokemon you can expect to see most success. Raging Bolt, of course. Fluttermane, of course. And then I would probably say, to be honest, like out of all the other Paradox Pokemon, because like obviously there are a lot of them, it's tough. Like I guess you could mention Roaring Moon as well. Actually, before I wrap this up, Roaring Moon with Proto is kind of cool because you can go for fast knockoffs in front of Cali. But again, this is just like another thing where it's like, oh, I'm here to check Calyrex Shadow. Also, like right now, I'd say Jugulus does Roaring Moon's job a bit better. The Dragon typing is kind of a liability in this format. It is like nice for Urshifu, but then they can just close combat you, right? So there are some drawbacks there, and like it's not the best user of Snarl because it's such a low special attack. Whereas like Jugulus, it kind of pairs well with the Snarl. It does have a better speed tier than Jugulus, but the thing is like, what do you run on the set, right? Acrobatics was always the most popular use of Roaring Moon, and like you're kind of departing from that a bit if you have a Groudon, because then it's like you're setting Proto up for this Mon, right? So maybe it would operate better on teams that don't set up Sun for it, ironically. But yeah, I'd say probably like Raging Bolt, Fluttermane are the two you can expect to be the most consistent, especially as like shown throughout this cut, right? I just think that they're like incredibly solid Pokemon. I could see Jugulus still retaining some success, mostly for the fact of like It is a fast Snarlmon that can pressure Calyrex Shadow, which is like good in the format, right? So there are like definitely some things that it can accomplish for sure. I would say that like when it comes to Paradox Pokemon, also Walking Wake is something you can expect to see a little bit of success, right? But frankly, besides that, I think you are a little bit limited on options that are going to be able to capitalize to the same degree as the ones up here already, right? I mean, as well too, like one thing worth noting for like the Paradox guys is just that like when you're considering when you're considering how they operate within the metagame, like it's always tied to like what their best partner is, right? So how you're enabling like another restricted. So like for example, like Iron Bundle might be another one I could see being good purely because it enables Miraidon really well, and Miraidon's really popular right now. But typically like it will depend on the partners and what is popular, right? You'll notice I didn't really bring up Iron Moth. I don't really rate this one that much. I mean, you have fire and poison coverage, which is cool, and like there are some things it can do in the metagame, but I just think how frail it is, it's like really bad for it. So it wasn't something I felt particularly passionate about mentioning. But yeah, I'd say that's pretty much it for the main list I kind of wanted to touch on. I just felt like these were some Pokemon that were like worth talking about just because they were around, but yeah, I think overall, like this is probably what I consider like the four best Paradox Pokemon right now. With if I had to pick a fifth, I'd say Screamtail, just because Screamtail can really fill a role that none of the other Paradoxes can, and it can be a really annoying support mon. But yeah, overall, really solid Pokemon, right? I think that there's like a lot of good tools that all the Paradox Pokemon can use. It's just that now with restricteds, it's more important now than ever to like actually have like really consistent use cases, and like Flutter and Raging Bolt provide that the most, right? With Walking Wake, Iron Bundle, Screamtail, Jugulus being like the next guys that kind of pop up there. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you think I'm underrating any Paradox Pokemon, or any Paradox Pokemon you think may be like way better than I'm giving them credit for. Yep, but make sure, to drop a comment. Let me know what you guys think and what you guys like to see next. All right, take it easy. Peace.